DeAndre felt like he'd lost his mind. That's impossible! How could Stephen be the sovereign? The Cassidy family couldn't believe it. That good-for-nothing they'd been ridiculing for years was one of the two most powerful existences in the country. He's just a son-in-law of our family. He can't be the sovereign. You probably mistook him for someone else. He's the former commander, that's all he is. Is there a reason I need to prove his identity? Jace asked in disdain. Kim looked at Stephen in disbelief. Her husband had been the sovereign all this time. Harry couldn't accept this. This makes no sense. Stephen must have hired actors to put on an act. Those supposed 3 criminals and this Empyrean Circle member are fake. If you think about it, why would anyone interrupt our celebration? Stephen's not happy we kicked him out of our family, so he wants revenge. He did this on purpose. We've been set up. Jace was about to storm over and give Harry a piece of his mind, but Stephen held him back. According to your line of reasoning, we're actors reciting lines from a script. Is that correct? Harry's confidence rose when Stephen didn't deny it immediately. He was convinced that this was a farce. That's right. You used to be a cripple confined to your wheelchair. How could you be the sovereign? Why don't you tell us the truth? You've always been dissatisfied with our family, and you've been planning your revenge for many years. You deliberately gave Grandpa counterfeit goods because you predicted that he'd get upset and throw it on the floor. The broken antique was a secret signal to your actors. Those 3 self-proclaimed criminals appeared with heads stuffed into suitcases. To make the act more realistic, you told them to kill a few ordinary civilians and disguise them as high-ranking people. After that, this self-proclaimed Empyrean Circle member made his appearance. He pretended to save the day and called you out as the sovereign to make everyone believe in your false identity. Am I right, Stephen? The more Harry spoke, the more detailed and dramatic he became. He ended his passionate explanation with a flourish. Some of the guests were drawn to his performance and convinced by his reasoning. DeAndre and the Cassidy family believed him. The family hurled insults at Stephen. I didn't think you were this petty and ruthless. You're despicable. You're going to die a horrible death. I knew it. How could he possibly be the sovereign? This time, most of the guests didn't join in. They looked at the Cassidy family like they were fools. Stephen applauded Harry. That's an impressive deduction. What do you think I should do? Should I surrender? When Stephen still didn't deny it, Harry was certain that he'd hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what I mean. Once he settled the situation, everyone here would bear witness to his capabilities. DeAndre would promote him and officially announce his position as the successor. Rebecca was disappointed that she'd lost out on yet another opportunity to win DeAndre's favor. She should have been the first one to catch on to Stephen's scheme. The rest of the family was also regretting not being as quick as Harry on the uptake. Harry waved his phone. Stephen, if you surrender now, I won't call the police. Stephen wasn't deterred in the slightest. Your reasoning is logical, but you've forgotten one important fact. What do you mean? My logic is perfect. There are no loopholes. It seems you've forgotten, so let me remind you. Grandpa asked the aristocrats to send backup. The Cassidy family froze in place like they'd been struck by lightning. DeAndre had requested the aristocratic families to send reinforcements, and they hadn't stood a chance against the criminals. The 3 men couldn't have been actors who Stephen hired. This one point invalidated Harry's entire deduction and proved Stephen's identity. Tori, Darian, and the rest of the group walked off the platform and knelt on one knee in front of Stephen. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Adams. Stephen nodded and motioned for them to stand up. Then, he turned back to Harry. The color had drained from his face. The aristocrats were proud and used to being in a position of authority. They didn't kneel to just anyone, but Tori and Darian's group had kneeled to Stephen. Jace gave the Cassidy family a pointed look. I warned you a minute ago, but you didn't listen. You even took it a step further and questioned the sovereign's identity. You didn't achieve anything except add another offense to your list of crimes. Any lingering doubts vanished. The guests in the Haynes family knelt on the floor and greeted Stephen respectfully. There was a 180-degree shift in DeAndre's attitude. He straightened his back and stood tall. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of a minute. Today's event was held to celebrate his birthday. He was supposed to be the person with the highest status, but it turned out that the position never had been his. DeAndre took the lead and dropped to one knee. He greeted Stephen with an aggrieved tone. The rest of the Cassidy family did the same. Kim and Stephen stood at the center of all the attention. "Stephen, am I dreaming?" Kim asked in a daze. He gently pinched her arm. "Did you feel that?" She nodded. This was really happening. "Why didn't you say anything?" "The Sovereign's identity is a national secret. It can't be casually revealed to the public. Also, I didn't want you and Valeria to worry about me." "But why?" Kim didn't finish her sentence, but Stephen understood what she was going to ask. If the Sovereign's identity was a national secret, then why were they openly revealing it now? "Because he's here," Stephen replied, gesturing to Jace. "I made an agreement with the Leviathan unit to keep my identity hidden. If he came here to seek me out and address me as the Sovereign in front of the crowd, then it means that the Leviathan unit has decided to make my identity public to some degree. Am I right, Jace?" "You've seen through everything, Mr. Adams," Jace said, impressed. "If you have something to tell me, let's go outside and talk. It's not appropriate with so many eyes on us. Kim, wait for me here. I'll be back soon." Stephen exited the mansion, and Jace followed him out. "Wait, Stephen." Kim wanted to go after him, but the guests surrounded her like a wave. They were all excited to chat with her. "Miss Kim, I apologize for the way I spoke to you earlier. Please forgive me." "Me too." Kim couldn't break free from the dense crowd. She could only patiently reply to each guest. On the other side of the hall were DeAndre and the Cassidy family, feeling utterly humiliated. They were in high spirits when the celebration began, but the main character had changed. Stephen's status had soared in the span of a few hours, while theirs had dropped to rock bottom. Everyone was waiting for the Cassidy family to say something and make an even bigger fool of themselves. They'd chased out the member with the highest status and authority in the country, and Helen had even slapped him in the face. The harsh truth was beginning to sink in. The Cassidy family had always found Stephen's confidence unusual, but never in a million years had they expected him to be the Sovereign. All this time, DeAndre had thought he was being patient with Stephen, but it was actually the other way around. The family had accused Stephen multiple times of benefiting from Kim's success and relying on the Cassidy and Fallon family's influence to rise to fame. But it was obviously the Cassidy and Fallon families who had soared to the top because of him. Countless doubts in DeAndre's mind were resolved. Why did Tyrell act so strangely whenever Stephen was around? Why was Stephen so fearless in the face of threats? And why had he and the Sovereign both gone to Cadus at the same time? The answer was because Stephen and the Sovereign had been one and the same all along. DeAndre had another realization. As the Sovereign, Stephen wouldn't lie to him. His gaze shifted to the platform. The antique he'd shattered had to be authentic, and it was a priceless one. None of the gifts he'd received could compare to that ceramic bowl. Its value could rival a country. The Cassidy family had arrived at the same conclusion. They'd missed out on an opportunity of a lifetime. Harry had yet to recover from his shock. "Grandpa, isn't there anything we can do?" he asked. Rebecca also mustered up her courage to speak. "There has to be a way out of this." DeAndre flew into a rage. The aristocratic families valued status and power over anything else. He was used to manipulation and schemes that went hand in hand with power struggles. Now that Stephen's identity was out in the open, every mystery he couldn't make sense of before had been slowly unraveling, including Harry and Rebecca's scheme. If Stephen were an ordinary person, he would have been kicked out of the family a long time ago. Harry and Rebecca stood to benefit the most from his expulsion, so they had to be the culprits. If the three criminals hadn't crashed the party, they never would have found out what they'd missed out on. The Cassidy family had fallen from the throne to the bottom of the valley. "You two still have the nerve to ask me what to do?" DeAndre had demanded. "If it weren't for you two coming up with those ridiculous accusations, none of this would have happened. Stephen is the Sovereign. He's an existence respected by all, but we provoke that very existence because of you two. I don't want to see your faces right now. Get the hell out of my house." His words were like a clap of thunder, and it made Rebecca tremble in fear. At this time, Harry had come back to his senses, and he was having a full-blown breakdown. He'd gone against the Sovereign and thoroughly offended him. Even if Stephen didn't bother coming back and dealing with him personally, there were many guests who wanted to get on the Sovereign's good side. They wouldn't hesitate to deliver justice in his stead. Even the Cassidy family was eyeing him in contempt. Harry's legs went weak, and he fell to his knees. Tears streamed down his face. "Grandpa, please save me." "And how exactly do you expect me to save you when I can't even save myself?" DeAndre snapped. "Have you forgotten all that nonsense you said about Stephen? It was you who claimed that his gift was fake. He's the sovereign of the country. Why would he ever give me a knockoff? I don't know where you got the courage to make such false claims." The blame had shifted to Harry, and Rebecca saw an opportunity to save herself. "I'm sorry, Harry," she thought, "but I don't have a choice." "Grandpa, Harry was the one who forced me to back up his claims. He deceived me. That's why I spoke up for him and criticized Stephen." Harry only needed to hear one sentence to grasp her true intentions. He made a prompt decision and retorted, "Rebecca, what nonsense are you talking about? It was you who came up to me and bribed me to help you kick Stephen out of the house. Don't you remember arguing with Kim before the celebration and luring me into helping you? Why don't we check the security cameras?" Like her brother, Rebecca was also not one to take false accusations lying down. The two of them started bickering, as if they were strangers on the streets who'd been slighted by looking at each other the wrong way. DeAndre was already furious, but watching the two main culprits shifting the blame made him even more angry. "Be quiet. You two kneel and wait for Stephen to come back." A 5-star hotel was located not too far away from the Cassidy family's residence. Stephen was on the rooftop, standing at the edge with his hands in his pockets and observing the streets below. The sweltering summer was over, and the beginning of autumn was here. A chilly breeze ruffled his hair and clothes. "When I retired, I told the Leviathan unit to search for someone to be the Sovereign's successor. Why are you here?" Jason knelt on one knee and stared at Stephen's back. From afar, Stephen looked like any other civilian, but up close, the intensity in his gaze hinted at his true identity. The prisoners broke out of the 7 Stars prison. One member from both the Cepheus subunit and Empyrean Circle were killed. Our country's in a precarious state. We have enemies overseas and within our borders. If we're not careful, we could lose everything. The Leviathan unit couldn't handle this on their own. They sent me to ask you to return to your position. Stephen didn't respond, but Jace didn't rush him. While he was waiting, he thought back to the incident at the 7 Stars prison. In that battle, the Cepheus subunit, who'd ensured the country's safety for decades, lost one of their members for the first time. It was also the first time that one of the Empyrean Circle members, who were responsible for the country's national defense, had been killed. Countless martial artists had fallen in battle, and even the general in charge of Annapolis's defense was dead. This was a huge blow to the country. Stephen was silent for a long time. During the incident with Vito, he had been disappointed with the Leviathan unit, but that wasn't the main reason he'd resigned from his position. He'd been on the battlefield for many years, and he was tired. He wanted to spend more time with his family. After resigning, Stephen hadn't paid much attention to the country's affairs, but he had instructed the palace to notify him if anything serious happened. The person he was today was an accumulation of his past experiences, and most of them had taken place on the battlefield. Even after retiring, he hadn't been able to give up on the country and forget about it completely. If he went back in time and was presented with the same choice, he would still make the same decision, because his family was now more important to him than the country. "I made up my mind when I retired," Stephen said quietly. "The country's affairs have nothing to do with me." Jason never heard him sound so resigned. "Mr. Adams!" Before he could get the words out, Stephen interrupted him. "You don't have to try to persuade me. I've never gone back on my decisions." Jace sensed the moment Stephen started circulating his inner energy. He knew he was about to make a big mistake, but he couldn't let him leave like this. He stood up and called, "Wait, Mr. Adams." Stephen glanced back at him with a cold look in his eyes. "Is there something else you'd like to say?" A chill permeated the air, and a heavy aura filled the open space. Jace tensed when a wave of pressure settled beside him. He was reminded of his training session with Stephen in the past. The incident at the Seven Stars prison had been one of the deadliest battles he'd experienced. The thought of running away had never crossed his mind, but it did now. He felt fear from the bottom of his heart. Jace calmed his nerves and held out a small, intricate box. "This is for you." Stephen didn't take it. He scrutinized the box with interest. "What is it?" "It's the Seraphim token." Stephen wasn't expecting the Leviathan unit to try so hard to get him to come back. It wasn't the token that surprised him. It was the significance and authority that the token held. "Is the Leviathan unit handing me the fate of a country?" The owner of the Seraphim token was equivalent to having the entire country in their hands. They had access to an unlimited supply of wealth, power, and influence. They had the authority to dismiss the Supreme Leader, disband the Leviathan unit, and mobilize all the hidden forces in the country. "They should be aware that I'm the Grand Palace Master. Hellcrown Palace possesses half of the world's wealth and influence. The U.S., Warhawk, and other countries are in possession of the other half. The Seraphim token might be valuable, but to me it's like icing on the cake." Jace understood that if the Leviathan unit hadn't betrayed Stephen's trust back then, he wouldn't have retired this early. He recalled his conversation with the Leviathan unit's leader before he left for Washington, D.C. What if Mr. Adams doesn't want to return to his position? If it comes down to that, there's one more thing you can try. Jace took a deep breath and steeled himself for what he was about to say. "This token isn't the only thing the leader of the Leviathan unit entrusted me with. He asked me to pass on a message. Aren't you curious about where the previous palace grandmasters went after they resigned from their positions? Put an end to the chaos running rampant in our country and eliminate the prisoners who've escaped. After you unify the world with the Seraphim token in hand, you'll have all the answers to your questions. Everything you want to know will be made clear." Stephen didn't think anything in the world could surprise him, but he never expected the Leviathan unit's leader to make such a dramatic proposal. "That cunning old man has a talent for making deals people can't refuse. But ending the chaos and eliminating the prisoners? That's not a simple task, not to mention unifying the world. If I accept this token, I'm afraid I'll use it to tie me to the country for the rest of my life." Everything Stephen had said was true, and Jace's heart sank. If Stephen didn't accept the token, even if the prisoners sent all the forces they had, they still wouldn't stand a chance against the prisoners. Many of the prisoners who'd escaped held Enzo, Gideon, and Bennett in high regard. Their martial arts weren't close to the immortal realm, but they were still difficult to deal with. The country had almost failed in suppressing Enzo, Gideon, and Bennett. If it weren't for their internal conflicts, and the fact that the Leviathan unit had prepared trump cards, Annapolis would have been destroyed. If the three of them joined forces, they could have wiped out the entire country. Jace knew all of that, but he didn't have anything to say even if Stephen refused. It was the Leviathan unit who dug themselves into this hole. "I don't go back on my decisions," Stephen said. "However, there are some deals I'm willing to accept. That cunning old man knew I wouldn't be able to pass up this offer. He wants to make a deal with me, and I have to admit that I'm interested." Jace was at a loss for words. While he was processing, Stephen took the small, exquisite box from his hand and opened it. There was an azure seal carved from ice inside. It was infused with a small amount of inner energy, and a flurry of snowflakes decorated the core. They appeared out of thin air and melted like real snow. Stephen casually placed the Seraphim token, which symbolized the highest authority, into his pocket and looked up at Jace, who was still stunned. "I accept this deal." Jace was bewildered by this turn of events, but as a high-ranking officer of the country who was affiliated with the Leviathan unit, he was knowledgeable and experienced. He snapped out of his daze. "Mr. Adams, please give me your instructions." "Since I've taken back my old position, did you bring the items?" Stephen asked. Jace nodded and made a call. 1 minute later, a man in black appeared. He knelt down and held out an encrypted safe. "Mr. Adams, the items you're looking for are in here." Jace and the man stared at Stephen as he took the safe and slowly entered the password. From the look on his face, he had to sort through years of memories to remember what it was. His movements were slow, as if he was afraid of damaging the contents. The two of them didn't rush him. They watched and waited patiently. The safe opened with a click when the password was entered. A familiar mask was inside with a neat and tidy coat at the bottom. The sword that gave its owner the authority to strike first and report later was nowhere to be seen. It was replaced by a brand new weapon, the Sword of the Heavens. It was a divine sword that only the leader of the country was worthy of wielding. The imperial sword was symbolic, but the owner was required to report to another authoritative figure. However, the Sword of the Heavens owner had free reign. Stephen picked up the repaired royal mask and put it on. His movements were steady, as if he'd practiced thousands of times. Jace shook out the folded coat and stepped forward to help put him on. The blood and the flames of war had disappeared, but to Stephen, the scent of battle lingered. He recalled every single detail of the transatlantic summit. Stephen ran his hand down the length of the sword. As if recognizing its owner, it glowed and vanished in a scatter of light. Mr. Adams has returned to his position. The Leviathan unit was in high spirits after receiving the news. They'd been stressed for days on end after riots at the 7-star prison. Emery and Huey's death hung in the air and dampened the mood. Two of the strongest martial artists in the country had been killed. Aside from Jace, who'd spent most of the battle inside the prison holding the prisoners back, the rest of the participants had sustained heavy injuries. Tegan, the head of the Cepheus subunit, had his strength reduced by half. Two of his swords had been damaged beyond repair. Hyde had sustained severe injuries and was in the hospital. It would be difficult for him to recover even if a doctor who specialized in ancient medicine were to treat him. Trey's injuries were also serious. He'd lost an arm, but because he was young, he had a chance to recovery. To protect the city of Annapolis, Yule had taken a direct hit from Enzo's manifestation. He was unconscious and in critical condition. As for Kane, who didn't appear to have participated in the battle, he was in fact the reason that Annapolis was still standing today. His technique had amplified their manifestations a stage closer to the immortal realm. Without him, the casualties would have increased by 4 or 5 times. However, activating the technique came with a heavy price. Kane's cultivation progress had regressed by 50 years, and his lifespan had been reduced by 10 years. There was no telling if he'd ever be able to use the technique again. During the final battle against Enzo, the Empyrean Circle member ranked first had made a timely return to Annapolis. Out of everyone present, Enzo had been the closest to the immortal realm. But a battle against 6 martial artists who'd had their cultivations amplified wasn't easy to win. Even if he'd managed to take them down, the injuries we would have sustained wouldn't have been worth it. At that point, Enzo, Gideon, and Bennett took the opportunity to retreat and went into hiding. Numerous prisoners had escaped during the chaos. It was already hard enough for the Leviathan unit to protect their own. Capturing the other prisoners was an impossible task. Stephen was the direct leader of the Empyrean Circle and their teacher. At this crucial moment, he was the only one the Leviathan unit could rely on. No matter how strong Enzo was, his cultivation wasn't as high as Vito's. With Stephen taking charge, it wouldn't take him long to take Enzo, Gideon, and Bennett down once and for all. The remaining prisoners would at most be at the Divine Grandmaster realm, which the country could deal with on their own. One of the higher-ups decisively changed the topic. The Sovereign is back, and the 7 Stars prison is half empty. What should we do next? We should release the lockdown on the country and assist Mr. Adams, another higher-up suggested. That way, we can wipe out the strongest prisoners on the loose and resolve the predicament in the shortest time possible. We can't lock up the country for long anyways. If we keep this up, the countries overseas will catch on to our internal strife and plot against us. We can't do that, someone else argued. If we send out all our forces, who will defend Annapolis? We need them to protect the injured. We can't lose any more of our people. In my opinion, it's better to leave this to Mr. Adams and let him handle this alone. We'll be dragging out the predicament, and the foreign countries will pressure us, but we could try and delay the news from leaking for as long as we can. I believe in Mr. Adams. It won't take him too long to take care of the prisoners. The Leviathan Unit's conference room was divided into two factions, and a heated debate broke out. Each party believed strongly in their views, and the quarrel continued for quite a while. "Are you questioning the Leviathan Unit's capabilities?" someone shouted. The other higher-up didn't budge an inch. He yelled back in an even louder voice, "Then are you questioning Mr. Adams' strength?" The higher-up was rendered speechless. What could he say to that? The Leviathan Unit's leader sighed as the argument intensified, and the room was on the verge of having a meltdown. He'd witnessed many of these debates ever since Stephen retired. He slammed his hand on the table. "That's enough." Everyone quieted down. The Leviathan Unit's leader held a high position. He emitted an intimidating and superior aura that naturally came with years of experience. The leader narrowed his eyes. When his gaze fell on the higher-ups who'd been arguing, they lowered their heads and avoided eye contact. He stared at them for a long time, making them break out in a cold sweat. Only then did he speak. "We all work for the country. Debates that divert from the topic at hand are a waste of time. Don't let this happen again." The tension in the air dissipated. Without waiting for a response, the leader continued. "Mr. Adams has accepted the Seraphim token. Don't forget, he's the sovereign, and the fate of our country is in his hands. Our next step is not for us to decide. Our goal is to assist Mr. Adams. We should do whatever he wants us to do." Understanding dawned on the higher-ups. Stephen was in possession of the Seraphim token. Whether it was wealth, influence, or authority, he was superior to the Leviathan Unit in every way. They didn't have the authority to give him orders anymore. They had to listen to his orders. The leader could tell that they finally understood. "He's our superior now. We need to get our act together." A day had passed since DeAndre's birthday celebration. After Stephen's discussion with Jace, they'd gone their separate ways. Stephen had taken Valeria from Angelo and Stephanie and returned home with Kim. When he'd gone to find Kim at the mansion, DeAndre and the rest of the Cassidy family had knelt down and begged for his forgiveness. Stephen didn't pay any attention to them. He didn't care about the Cassidy or the Haynes families. But without the Sovereign's approval, the Cassidy family didn't dare to get up. They had been kneeling since yesterday afternoon. Kim had some misgivings with the family, but DeAndre had treated her and Valeria well. It was because of him that the Cassidy family had held back whenever Stephen wasn't around. DeAndre had a tendency to take things too far, but he did have her best interests in mind. "Stephen, you don't have to forgive them, but they've been kneeling for more than a day. It's already evening." "What's there to forgive?" Stephen asked with a shrug. "I didn't tell them to do anything. They knelt on their own and asked me to forgive them." Kim frowned, but she didn't say anything else. Stephen cleared his throat awkwardly. "Actually, what I meant to say was, we're all family, so there's no need for them to kneel. Nor, can you head over and tell them it's fine?" Kim brightened at his words. Nor was amused by how fast Stephen had changed his mind because of his wife. He held in his laughter as he left. "Stephen, are you really going to leave?" Kim asked when they were alone in the room. She'd been worrying since yesterday. When they came back from the celebration, before she had a chance to say anything, Stephen had told her that he'd retired from his position as the Sovereign and that Jace was here to ask him to return. "Yeah, but you don't have to worry. It might be troublesome for other people, but I can take care of it." "Okay, if you say so." Stephen had made his decision, so as his wife, Kim decided to support him from the sidelines. "I'll be back in half a year, or maybe even 3 months, but I'll definitely come back. I've arranged for my people to protect you and Valeria." Stephen placed a piece of paper in Kim's hand. "If you need anything, contact this number and explain the situation. He'll handle it." Kim put the paper in her pocket and hugged him tightly. They stayed like that until well after midnight. At some point, she fell asleep. When she woke up, she was on the bed, and Stephen's clothes had disappeared from the rack. Stephen had arrived at the airport early in the morning. He wasn't wearing his uniform because it would attract too much attention. 2 tall and eye-catching men stood behind him. One of them was Noor, and the other was Jace. "Mr. Adams, I've contacted Annapolis," Jace said. We can board at any time. Anton, Jakari, and Claus had caused significant bloodshed in California. After wiping out the Barclay family, they had killed many of the high-ranking officials in the local government and cut off communication between California and the rest of the world. The military couldn't enter without orders from the higher-ups of the state. Once they killed off the Cassidy and Haynes families, who were celebrating in Washington, D.C., California would have been as good as theirs. Fortunately, Stephen was there, and their scheme failed. Jace followed up and made a trip to California. He revealed his identity as a member of the Empyrean Circle and took command over the state. He mobilized the soldiers in the military base nearby to protect the civilians, and he arranged for a group of officials to temporarily take charge of the state's operations. Annapolis would soon arrange for new officials to take over their positions, and the state would return to normal. "Okay, what's our first stop?" Stephen asked. Jace had given him a document with relevant information pertaining to the 10 most dangerous prisoners who'd escaped, but he didn't have time to look it over. Yesterday, he'd spent most of his time contacting the palace's members. The country had changed overnight, and the past hierarchy had been overturned. The rules and regulations of the past were no longer applicable, and this affected the palace as well. As the Grand Palace Master, Stephen had a responsibility to make arrangements for them. The palace operated in the shadows, and some of the intel they had was not information that the Leviathan unit possessed. It was important to maintain their confidentiality. Along with these changes, there were some people who'd taken advantage of the chaos to begin plotting against the country. The Leviathan unit had lost the ability to govern the country, and the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Nor considered their first destination. "I suggest we head to the northern lands and deal with the prisoner there before anything else." Before their discussion could continue, the plane reached the runway and came to a stop up ahead. Stephen took the lead and led Nor and Jace out of the waiting room. The ceremonial guards lined up in 2 rows to see them off. A red carpet had been laid out from the cabin to the door of the waiting room. The soldiers whom the military had sent were rehearsing on the side. When Stephen stepped onto the carpet with Nor and Jace, the ceremonial guards and the soldiers knelt on one knee, lowered their heads, and greeted them. Stephen's expression was the same as usual. He walked towards the cabin without any hesitation in his stride. As the former commander, he'd experienced this etiquette many times before. Jace himself was a member of the Empyrean Circle. He was a high-ranking officer of the military, so this was nothing new to him either. As for Nor, he was one of the core members of an organization that operated in the shadows. He was accustomed to secrecy, and he'd never experienced this kind of high-profile reception before. Even so, he had nerves of steel, and nothing in this world could shake him except for the Grand Palace Master. The 3 of them boarded the plane with a high reception. Soon, the plane took off and ascended above the clouds. Aside from the 2 pilots, they were the only passengers. After getting settled, they continued their discussion. "Why did you suggest the northern lands?" Jace asked. Stephen had told him that he'd be bringing his bodyguard along for his skill in martial arts and strategic planning. Jace was curious as to how talented he was. "The northern lands are located at the border of our country," Nor explained. "They lack resources, and the local forces have a complicated hierarchy. They're too far away for the officials to manage them properly. Now that the Leviathan unit is in decline, it'll be difficult for us if the local forces make their move." Jace didn't agree or disagree. "I see, but that doesn't explain why you chose the northern lands." Nor glanced at Stephen, who gave him a nod. He continued. "There are 3 reasons. First is the location of the northern lands. They're at the edge of our country, but they're also within our borders. They have access to the countries overseas and the other states, which means they pose the highest threat of exposing and spreading our internal strife. Second, the prisoner who escaped the northern lands isn't that strong of a martial artist. The territory is difficult to navigate, so he's trapped there for the time being. It won't take us too long to get rid of him. Third, because the northern lands are located so far away from civilization, no matter how big of a commotion we cause, it won't attract any attention. We're carrying out a special operation, and the more confidential it remains, the better. If news of the Sovereign making his move is exposed, the prisoners will go into hiding, and it'll be more difficult to seek them out. Taking all of these points into consideration, I suggest the Northern Lands as our first destination." Nor concluded his lengthy explanation with a question aimed at Jace. "What do you think, sir?" Jace was surprised to find he had nothing to say. The analysis was perfect. Stephen's bodyguard was even more impressive than he'd imagined. When Jace first saw him, he didn't have much of an impression. He was quiet and didn't talk to anyone except Stephen. This was a perfect example of one should not judge a book by its cover. Someone like him couldn't possibly be an ordinary bodyguard. If Stephen was the Grand Palace Master, his bodyguard was most likely a member of the mysterious organization. "May I ask for your name?" "I'm the Northern Guardian of the Palace. I'm responsible for Mr. Adams's safety." His introduction confirmed Jace's guess. "I agree with Nor's suggestion," Stephen said. "The Northern Lands will be our first stop." Jace nodded. His job on his mission was to assist Stephen. 3 hours later, the plane landed in a remote city some distance away from the Northern Lands. Several members of the Leviathan unit were waiting for them. They gave Stephen a brief overview of the prisoner's profile. Seymour Jones, ranked 9th on the list. He's cunning and cruel by nature. 100 years ago, he took advantage of the chaos overseas to instigate an invasion of multiple foreign countries. He's suspected to have Warhawk's support. He was also involved in our war with the Alliance. Now he has a connection with the Mafia in the Northern Lands. He was captured after you became the Sovereign. Jace chuckled. "This is what we call fate." Stephen let out a sigh. "What else is new?" "Continue." "We've made arrangements for your transportation. The train will depart tonight and arrive at the Northern Lands tomorrow." Meanwhile, in the Robinson family's mansion in Warhawk, Brent had received news that the U.S. had locked down their country. After being imprisoned in a foreign country, he rarely left the house and spent most of his time paying close attention to the news. He was waiting for an opportunity to take his revenge. His brother, Samir, was busy fighting for the throne. Brent had laid low and hadn't made any mistakes since his release, so the Robinson family had relaxed their monitoring. When the U.S. locked down their borders, Brent knew that this was his chance. It was obvious that something was going on internally. The Northern Lands weren't as developed as the big city. At the center of the region was an inconspicuous house. On the outside, it looked ordinary, but its interior was luxuriously decorated. The facilities were expensive and resembled the ones in big cities. A man in dark attire with 9 scars on his neck was leaning against the mahogany couch. He took a sip of wine from the glass in his hand. "This is good wine." A beautiful woman was snuggled in his arms. She pressed her voluptuous body against him and whispered in his ear, "Mr. Seymour, have you thought about it?" Seymour downed the rest of his wine and set the glass on the table. "The boss has treated me quite well, so it's understandable that he wants me to do something for him in return. But that can wait." He held the woman's waist and slipped his hand under her dress. The expensive wine glass fell off the table and shattered to pieces on the floor. The woman grabbed his wrist. "Mr. Seymour, don't be impatient." Seymour was annoyed by the interruption, but he kept a smile plastered on his face. "What's wrong, Winnie?" The boss of the multinational gang in the Northern Lands had eyes everywhere in the region. He sent his spies to monitor Seymour the second they arrived. But Seymour wasn't a pushover, even though he was a criminal who'd escaped from prison. He held nothing back when he encountered the spies from the gang. He killed them and threw their corpses into the alley. After that, the friction between Seymour and the gang intensified. The boss understood his value, so he invited him to join the gang to keep him in check. Seymour ended up agreeing because the gang's influence could help him escape the country. Both parties knew the other wasn't sincere. It was a mutual alliance to achieve their respective goals. On the surface, the beautiful woman, Winnie, was a gift the boss had sent as a reward for accepting his task. But all parties involved, including Seymour himself, knew that she'd been sent there to monitor him. Winnie reached into her bra and pulled out a phone. "If you want me, you'll have to do one thing for the boss first." "I'll get to that later," Seymour said impatiently. Winnie ignored him and showed him the picture on her screen. It'll be too late by then. An important member of our gang was captured. They've taken him to their hotel. In the picture, there was a young man in a red t-shirt. His facial features were unclear, but there was a noticeable scar on his ear. Is that him? Seymour asked. A beautiful woman was sitting on his lap, but he couldn't enjoy her until he completed the boss's task. His annoyance turned into rage. Fine, I'll bring him back. Wait for me here. Seymour grabbed the bottle of wine and downed the liquid in one breath. He tossed the bottle onto the floor and staggered out of the room. After he left, Winnie's charming smile fell, replaced by a disgusted expression. She rang the bell to notify the staff. Clean this place up, she instructed. She left the room with her purse and went to the restroom. After checking the stalls and making sure she was alone, she took out her phone and dialed a number. When the call connected, no one spoke on the other line. Winnie whispered into her phone. Seymour is leaving the city. Without waiting for an answer, she hung up and deleted the call records. She put her phone into her purse and reapplied her makeup. As she thought about Seymour's hands on her body, her disgust returned, but she concealed it well and left the restroom. The young man in a red t-shirt put his phone away after Winnie hung up. Sir, she's confirmed that Seymour is leaving the city. He's on his way here. The tall man in front of him nodded. Well done. When this is over, return to headquarters and give your report. For now, head back and don't give yourself away. The man in the red t-shirt dropped to one knee with an expectant look on his face. Thank you, sir. 3 people appeared from the darkness after he left. It was Stephen, Noor, and Jace. The tall man knelt down and greeted them respectfully. He was the Leviathan unit member who'd waited for them at the airport when they first arrived at the city near the northern lands. Jace was intrigued. He was skilled at leading an army, but he didn't have any experience with using undercover spies. Your subordinate has integrated himself into the gang so well that no one can tell he's not one of them. Know yourself. Know your enemy, and you will win 100 battles, the Leviathan unit member said. I was sent to the northern lands to monitor the gang. It's been 20 years since then, and I've developed a well-connected network. I'm acquainted with the deputy leader of the gang and some of the core members. Stephen and Noor nodded along. The palace's intelligence network was much more extensive than the Leviathan units. Their secret guards were also first-rate intelligence personnel. The Leviathan unit member had done a good job, but he still had a long way to go. We can wait for Seymour here and deal with him when he arrives, Jace said. Seymour was ranked 9th on the list of prisoners they had to find and eliminate, but his overall martial arts were average. He wasn't anywhere close to reaching the immortal realm. The only reason he was ranked high on the list was because he was being compared to the prisoners who'd escaped. Jace didn't know how strong Noor was, but as Stephen's bodyguard, his martial arts had to be profound. Either one of them could take Seymour down in an instant. Don't be too careless, Stephen warned. I have a feeling it won't be that simple. When he broke through to the 11th level of the technique he'd learned from the priest and reached the immortal realm, he'd developed a sixth sense. It was similar to a combination of intuition and foresight. He had a vague understanding of the future. It was hard to pinpoint the reason, but his instincts had never failed him. His instincts right now were telling him that Seymour wouldn't be falling into their trap so easily. Stephen wanted to tell Jace that he should prepare in case anything unexpected happened, but he didn't have any evidence, and he didn't want to start a meaningless debate. Back then, the main reason the Leviathan unit had trusted the erudites as students over him was because of his lack of evidence. Unlike the majority of the Empyrean Circle, Jace wasn't an aristocrat. He was a martial artist whom the Leviathan unit had independently trained before Stephen took him on as a student. Stephen couldn't tell what extent Jace trusted him to, because his loyalty towards his teacher and the Leviathan unit were blurred due to his origins. The trust that Jace had for him was not the same as the aristocrats' because of his affiliation with the Leviathan unit. As the sovereign, Stephen knew that Jace would accept whatever he told him to do, but he didn't want him to feel forced to carry out his orders under the pressure of authority. He thought it over and decided that this would be a good learning opportunity for Jace. When Seymour left the house in a drunken stupor and turned down the street out of sight, his steps became steady and the haze in his eyes cleared. He dashed into an alley, took off his jacket, and put on a wig. His appearance had changed drastically, and he was almost unrecognizable. There were many passerbys coming and going, and after this many twists and turns, Seymour was confident that no one was following him. He took his jacket, and a small circular device fell out of one of the pockets. It was a tracking device that Winnie had slipped into his jacket when she was straddling him. He wasn't sure if it was the boss of the gang who'd instructed her to track him, or if she'd done it for her own ulterior motives. Either way, both of them were suspicious, and he didn't think it was necessary to assist the gang anymore. Seymour made his way to the main road and blended in with the crowd. He stopped at a car center nearby and threw a stack of cash onto the counter. "Is anyone there? Give me an off-road vehicle and fill up the tank." The owner poked his head out from the back room and strolled up to the counter. He picked up the cash and sifted through the bills. There was around $100,000. This was a small city near the border, and it was rare to see someone with this much money. "I have a wide selection of off-road vehicles. I don't know which model you're looking for." As he spoke, he held his hand behind his back and signaled to his employees. They got the hint and surrounded Seymour. The customers at the car center left the store to avoid getting caught up in the conflict. They saw Seymour as a fool who'd exposed his wealth. Waving that much money around was asking for a robbery. The residents in the northern lands didn't know why the government was in chaos, but their monitoring had lessened over the past few days. Many people were taking advantage of the diminished security to commit crimes. After the customers left, an employee shut the door, plunging the store into darkness. The owner of the car center sauntered to the wall and flicked the switch to turn on the lights. He reached for a steel pipe behind the counter and pointed it at Seymour. "How much money do you have left? Give me everything you have." The employees picked up random pipes and stools around the store, eyeing him with greedy expressions. Seymour had been locked up in prison for 100 years, and he was puzzled by their actions. Anyone who could take out this much money on a whim obviously didn't have a normal background. "You want money? I have a lot of it. What off-road vehicles do you sell here? Give me whatever you have and fill it up." His goal was to escape the country. All he needed to do was reach the border. With his martial arts, he could breeze past the armed guards without breaking a sweat. The United States' money would be useless to him once he went overseas. The border was 200 miles away from this city. With his stamina, he could make it to the border within a reasonable time, but it was much more convenient with a car. One of the employees sneered. "You're still asking for a car? Haven't you realized the situation you're in?" "He might have a lot of money, but he's not too smart," another employee said. "You still don't get it?" The owner slammed his pipe onto the counter. A large dent appeared on the surface. "Hand me your money, or your head will look like this countertop." Seymour didn't care for their threats, but he was in a hurry to get a car. He tried to reason with them again. "I have a lot of money. Give me the off-road vehicle, and all of it will be yours." The owner of the car center and his employees still didn't take Seymour seriously, and they were beginning to test his patience. "I could have given you the money, but I don't think that's necessary anymore." The owner snickered. "You asked for it, brat." He motioned for his employees to beat him to a pulp, but what happened next erased the smug smile from his face. Seymour made quick work of the employees and walked up to the owner. Don't come near me." The owner was terrified. When he took a step back, he tripped over a steel pipe and fell on the floor. "Where's the off-road vehicle?" Seymour repeated. The owner was unnerved by the strange smile on his face and scrambled to his feet. He led Seymour to the garage at the back of the store. "This is it. The gas is over there." Seymour nodded, and the owner thought he was off the hook, but his hopes were crushed in the next second. "I should teach you a lesson before I leave." Seymour flicked his wrist, severing the owner's arm from his shoulder. He stepped past the screaming owner and filled the vehicle's tank. He got in the driver's seat and drove out of the car center. If this were 100 years ago, he would have killed them all. They should consider themselves lucky that he was in a hurry to reach the border. An hour later, the terrified owner called the police. Jace's expression darkened when the Leviathan unit member informed him. He couldn't understand what had given their plan away. "What's the situation?" Stephen asked, walking up to them. "A martial artist attacked the employees of a car center," Jace explained. "There aren't that many martial artists here. I'm sure it's Seymour." Jace had been confident that their plan was foolproof, but Seymour had caught on somehow. He'd been waiting for him at the hotel with the Leviathan unit member. The two cities weren't that far from each other. A normal person could have rushed over in half an hour, but there was no sign of him even after an hour had passed. Just when Jace was thinking that something had gone wrong, the local police station received a report from a car center and informed the Leviathan unit. The two of them had rushed to the scene. It had been more than an hour since Seymour drove off. Considering the speed of an off-road vehicle, he was probably close to the border by now. If Seymour escaped, the Sovereign's comeback would be off to a bad start and put the country in a disadvantageous position. It'd only be a matter of time before news spread that the prisoners had broken out, and the person who'd let this happen would be condemned by the country. Jace frantically tried to come up with a solution. "You know, Tyrell was in the same situation some time ago," Stephen said. Jace looked at him in a fluster. "What do you mean?" "He was careless when he encountered the scene of a crime, because he was confident that he could handle it. He failed to scope out his surroundings carefully enough and gave his enemies the chance to frame him. Do you remember what I taught you in the past? Our enemies are never as simple as they seem. They're cunning and manipulative. If you don't consider every possibility, you'll find yourself in deep trouble. When victory is in sight, it's easy to get caught up in the moment and make mistakes. But all it takes is one slip-up to ruin your life. Do you understand now?" In truth, Jace hadn't given his warning much thought. Thinking back, Stephen probably didn't push the issue because he didn't think he'd listen. If he were in Stephen's shoes, he wouldn't have trusted him either. Stephen had made it clear that he wanted a normal life, but he'd forced him out of retirement. "I'm sorry, Mr. Adams, for many things." Stephen patted Jace's shoulder. "It's all right. Let this be a lesson to you. I know what you're apologizing for, but it's not necessary. You have a duty to follow orders. You've been doing well. Keep up the good work. Also, you don't have to worry. I've already made arrangements." He turned to the Leviathan unit member. "Me and Jace will take care of the rest. Be careful not to reveal our identities." "Yes, sir," he replied. The Sovereign had full control over the situation, and the Leviathan unit's responsibility was to provide him and Jace with their full support. Meanwhile, Seymour was speeding across the grassland. He had an ominous feeling when he spotted a figure over the horizon. He turned the steering wheel, planning to avoid whoever it was, but then he realized that the figure was approaching him. It was a young man. When he was 300 feet away, he lifted his hand. By the time his arms were raised, he was already in front of the vehicle. Seymour had a bad feeling when he first noticed the young man, and he was prepared for an ambush. The moment the young man's fist came crashing through the window, Seymour did two things in rapid succession. One was to break the window, and the other was to jump out. Seymour rolled to a stop on the ground and looked back. His off-road vehicle had been destroyed. It was a shame, but he was only a few miles away from the border. With his speed and stamina, he could make it to the other side in half an hour. "Who are you? I've never seen you before. Why did you break my car?" The young man's strength was evident from the damage he'd caused. Seymour couldn't let down his guard. Even though he was cruel and merciless, he didn't kill just anyone. If he had the upper hand, he wouldn't mind torturing his opponent to death. But if he was at a disadvantage, he'd run away the first chance he had. "You're Seymour Jones, correct?" Nora asked. Seymour didn't reply. How had his identity been discovered so quickly? "I don't know who that is." His tone was calm, and there was no hint of a lie, but his fast reaction speed before the vehicle was destroyed had given him away. Nora grinned. "Looks like you are him." Stephen had a feeling that Seymour had caught on to their plan, so he'd sent Nora after him ahead of time. Nora was at the peak of the Divine Grandmaster realm. A distance of 200 miles was equivalent to a light jog. "We've never met before. We don't have any grudges against each other. Why are you stopping me?" Seymour was trying to figure out the young man's identity, but he gave nothing away. I don't have a grudge against you, but this is an order from my boss, so please die. Noor's aura surged, and he leaped into the air. The surrounding wildlife scampered away in fear at the presence of an existence at the top of the food chain. Seymour was surprised. You're a peak divine grandmaster? It's good that you know. Do you want to take the easy way out and surrender? Or do you want to go about this the hard way and then surrender? You think I'm afraid of you? Seymour unleashed his own aura, manifesting a faint shadow behind him. He was also a divine grandmaster, but his aura was much weaker compared to Noor's. Their two auras clashed. The animals and plants that were caught in between were wiped out of existence. The fields of grass that were once teeming with life were turned into a wasteland. The range of Seymour's aura had been suppressed and was shrinking rapidly. He knew if he waited any longer, he would never have the courage to make a move. He pressed his palms together, and a phantom of a god appeared behind him. He made a strange hand gesture, pointing at the sky and then at the ground. Noor was well versed in many types of martial arts. He saw through Seymour's technique with one glance. His eyes gleamed as he imitated the gestures. Seymour was stunned. He knew he was at a disadvantage, so it was important for him to go all out at the beginning of the match. But he never thought the young man would be so reckless and copy his movements. He'd trained for years to perfect his martial arts. The young man's movements were sloppy, and it was obvious he'd never made those gestures before in his life. How could he possibly overpower him? Seymour increased the strength in his hand. You're making a big mistake. Noor's smile widened. Then what are you waiting for? Come at me. The two of them closed the distance of hundreds of feet in an instant. The moment they exchanged blows, Seymour could feel that something was off. The young man had suppressed his martial arts that he was so proud of in a matter of seconds. His movements and the flow of his inner energy were in the young man's control. If this continued, he would lose the battle. But he couldn't lose. In a moment of desperation, Seymour recalled his chance encounter with the man in a black robe after he'd escaped from Seven Stars prison. The man had taught him a set of formations and given him 3 talismans. Seymour was impatient at being held up, but the man had stopped him when he tried to attack and left without another word. The whole thing was suspicious. He'd kept the items, but he'd never thought about using them until now. In a life and death crisis, he couldn't afford to worry about the consequences. Seymour gritted his teeth and took a direct hit from the young man's fist. He laughed maniacally when he was sent tumbling to the ground. He seized the opportunity while there was a gap between them to pull out the talisman. The young man had caught up to him, but it was too late. Thank you for that fist of yours. I'll return it back to you 10 times, 100 times, or even 1,000 times over. Noor frowned when Seymour placed the talisman on his chest. A familiar scene sent a chill down his spine. In all his years as a martial artist, he'd never lost that badly to the point of being seriously injured until his fight with Reven Blaine. They were only martial grandmasters, and in the beginning, they were no match for him. But after they activated that strange talisman and joined forces, their strength had increased exponentially. When they landed a hit on him, the force of their attack wasn't something a martial grandmaster was capable of. It was similar to an attack from a martial artist who is at or close to the immortal realm. Noor had only been at the intermediate stages of the Divine Grandmaster realm back then, and one blow had knocked him out. It was a miracle he'd made it to Stephen's house in his delirium. If he hadn't, he would have passed out on the streets. Although Seymour was by himself, he was a Divine Grandmaster. How strong would he become after using the talisman? Blood trickled down the corner of Seymour's mouth as his aura soared from the talisman's effects. I've never felt such power before. It's a good thing you're here. You'll be my first test subject. Noor pulled himself out of his reverie and shifted into an offensive stance. Don't get too overconfident. He'd only been using 30% of his strength against Seymour. With that talisman, he couldn't hold back anymore. Seymour smirked. I don't have a grudge against you, but you insisted on stopping me. You'll have to pay with your life. He made the same strange gesture, pointing at the sky and then at the ground. His manifestation reappeared behind him. The aura it emitted was much stronger than before. The talisman had evened out the playing field, and both sides had an equal chance of winning. Seymour took a step forward and pointed at Noor. He gathered his inner energy at the fingertip and released it in a burst of light. His manifestation imitated his movements. Compared to his previous attempt, it was like the diameter of the opening had shrunk, but the amount of water remained the same. The increased pressure correlated with the force of the inner energy being released. It was similar to the difference between running tap water and a high-pressure water gun, except it was much more destructive. To Noor, battles were thrilling, but this was turning out to be anything but an exhilarating match between two martial artists. He thought it'd be easy to get rid of Seymour, but he was suddenly caught up in a complicated life-or-death battle. What exactly was that talisman? This was a question that the palace had been trying to get answers to. Even with the palace's extensive resources and the five guardians' vast knowledge, they still hadn't fully grasped the true essence of the talisman. After the Leviathan unit took the leader of Vindictus, Odin, into their custody, the palace had sent out a large number of guards to investigate. But they'd ended up empty-handed even after 6 long months. Now the talisman was making a reappearance, and it was in the possession of a random prisoner on the run. Noor had a feeling that the riots at the Seven Stars prison weren't simply a coincidence orchestrated by the prisoners themselves. There was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes. Seymour was their only clue, and he had to capture him alive. Noor deliberated his options and decided to go on the defensive instead. His aura rose, and a phantom of a dragon materialized behind him. Seymour couldn't believe it. They were both divine Grand Masters. He was at the beginning stages, while his opponent was at the peak. After using the talisman, he had to have surpassed him. His opponent knew that, but he was still holding back. Their two phantoms clashed in the sky, scattering clouds and sending shockwaves through the air. They were called divine grandmasters for a reason, because at their true strength, the power they displayed was no different from that of a god. A violent explosion rattled the earth. The grass was blown away, and the ground tore apart. The smoke dissipated, revealing a deep crater nearly 300 feet wide. It resembled the aftermath of a destructive weapon of war. Even the city nearby felt the earth shake. Jace looked in the direction of the vibration, but he couldn't tell what was happening. "I sense Noor's aura," Stephen said. "I don't recognize the other one, but it's probably Seymour's." Jace realized that Stephen had sent Noor to intercept Seymour in advance. That was why he was so calm when they first received the police report. Jace was impressed with Stephen's ability to remain one step ahead of his enemy at all times. His admiration for him was indescribable. "You're incredible, Mr. Adams." Stephen waved his hand dismissively. "It's not worth mentioning. With your skills, if you thought about the situation carefully, you would have made the same decision." "I'll be more careful in the future," Jace promised. He glanced over the horizon where the explosion had taken place. He was a bit worried about Noor. "Will your bodyguards be all right by himself?" Stephen leisurely leaned against the back of the chair with his eyes closed. "Noor will be fine. His martial arts are more profound than you think." At the grassland, Seymour was hunched over with his hands on his knees, panting heavily. The sudden rise in his strength was hard to control. It had taken every ounce of his energy to launch one attack, and the backlash was severe. He scanned his surroundings, but he couldn't sense the young man's aura anywhere. He had to have been reduced to ashes. Seymour laughed and collapsed on the ground. He tore the talisman off his chest, and it turned into dust. His aura dropped rapidly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the other talismans from the man in the black robe. He still had 2 more left. That wasn't a bad move, but aren't you too relaxed for someone on the run? Seymour looked up in alarm. Noor leaped out of the rubble and landed on his feet. The collision hadn't left him unscathed either. His aura was weaker than before, and his inner energy was in disarray. But even if he was injured, his cultivation was higher than Seymour's. Now that he wasn't under the effects of the talisman anymore, Noor could easily take him down. Seymour was horrified. He rushed to place another talisman on his chest, but Noor was 1 step ahead of him. "Don't even think about it." Noor closed the distance between them in a split second and punched Seymour in the abdomen. The talisman slipped from his grasp as he doubled over in pain. "That's enough of your tricks." Noor pulled out his dagger and slammed the hilt into Seymour's neck, knocking him unconscious. 2 hours later, Seymour awoke to an intimidating young man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Jace Sinclair staring down at him menacingly. But how could he possibly be that powerful martial artist who'd suppressed the prisoners all on his own before he left to join the battle outside? "Maybe you should turn around," Stephen said. "He's that scared from seeing your face. What if he passes out? It'll be a hassle to wake him up again." To Seymour's relief, the young man who resembled Jace Sinclair turned around respectfully. So he wasn't Jace at all. He was just someone who looked like him. A member of the Empyrean Circle would never take orders from someone else. As Seymour calmed down, he stole another glance at the young man just to make sure. This time, he noticed the eye-catching sword at his waist. Seymour would never be able to mistake that sword for an ordinary weapon if he had tried. A wave of panic overwhelmed him once more. How could you possibly be Jace Sinclair? Jace perked up at the mention of his name and turned around again with an all-too-familiar smile. "Did you finally recognize me?" Seymour's head spun. He felt lightheaded, and he wasn't sure if it was from shock or if it was because he'd been knocked out so hard. If he really was Jace, then he had no chance of escaping. While he was despairing, the other young man cut in. "I don't care if you know Jace or not. Where did you get this talisman?" Seymour suddenly realized another terrifying fact. Just now, Jace had regarded this young man as his superior. As a member of the Empyrean Circle, who could make someone as pretentious as him act so respectfully? Seymour shifted his attention to the young man. He was wearing a mask, and he was shorter than Jace, but in Seymour's eyes, he seemed larger than life. The young man's intense gaze made him shudder. Before Seymour had woken up, Stephen had put on his mask to hide his face. He could guess what he was panicking about. "I'm the Divine Sovereign. Where did you get this talisman? If you tell me, I'll spare you." Seymour came to another realization. Their country only had one Divine Sovereign, and he was a man of his word. With his status and authority, he was on equal footing with the Supreme Leader and the Leviathan unit. Seymour was reluctant to give the Sovereign the answers he wanted, but he was his only hope at survival. "After I escaped from prison, a man in a black robe knocked me over with one move and tossed me these items." Stephen exchanged a glance with Jace. There weren't that many people who could catch a Divine Grandmaster off guard. "Have you seen this man before?" "Of course I have. He was the one who freed Enzo, Gideon, and Bennett and restored their cultivation. He didn't release anyone else and left." Seymour narrated the events that took place after Gideon opened the cells. "One last question. Where was your exact location when that man gave you the talismans?" It was obvious that the man in the black robe had infiltrated the Seven Stars prison to break Odin out. Vindictus and Devil Hall were two organizations that made their moves at random and went back into hiding right after. They were like weeds that couldn't be exterminated for good. They always bloomed again in the spring. Stephen had always wanted to find out the relationship between their organizations. They might have had a connection with the priest who taught him his cultivation technique. He had spent a short 6 months of peace with his family, and they were all he could ever ask for. But now he had returned to his position and had an opportunity to find the answers to his questions. He couldn't let it go. "I was at the Blue River Mountains near Annapolis," Seymour said. Stephen nodded and turned to Jace. "Can you keep a low profile and escort him back to Annapolis? I promise to spare him if he's told us the truth." "Understood, Mr. Adams," Jace replied, kneeling down. "There's no time to lose. You should leave immediately." Jace stood up and knocked Seymour unconscious. He might have been able to avoid death, but he wouldn't be able to avoid punishment. He'd harmed many civilians and almost risked exposing the country's internal issues to the countries overseas. There would be severe consequences for his actions. Jace hauled Seymour over his shoulder and carried him out of the hotel room. Stephen propped his legs up on the coffee table and leaned against the couch. He fell into deep thought. At this time, in the distant country of Warhawk, Brent was reading a report from his subordinate. He threw his head back and laughed. It had been a long time since he'd received good news. The information was from a source he'd established back when he was in the U.S. to ensure his safety. His source was slow, but reliable. The U.S. was in chaos, and this was his chance to add fuel to the fire. To achieve that, his first destination was the Backwater Security Company. The royal families had founded the corporation through a partnership. To the public, the company had been established to protect the people, but in reality, it was a laboratory devoted to gene research. Numerous members of the company had undergone genetic modification. At the lowest floor of the Backwater Security Company, Brent walked up to the man seated behind the desk. "I want to mobilize your people. All of them." 12 muscular men in suits and sunglasses were brought into the room. This was the first time Brent had asked for assistance from the Backwater Security Company. He didn't know how capable they were. The man behind the desk, Medellin, got out of his seat and introduced his team. "Humans who undergo genetic modification in our company do not experience fear, hesitation, or greed. They're weapons of war that exist solely for the mission's objective." Brent was satisfied. In his head, he'd imagined a long line of modified humans being produced in a laboratory. Even an army couldn't compare to them. He pointed out a location on the map of the U.S. "They say a handful of prisoners have escaped to the northern lands. It's the best region to infiltrate the country. Cause a commotion and sneak in. Then, attack the Leviathan unit's headquarters." Medellin and his team followed Brent's instructions. The team used their fake identities and split up to sneak into the U.S. After Jace left to escort Seymour back to Annapolis, Stephen and Nora stayed behind in the northern lands. The region was in turmoil, and they planned to reestablish order before they left. In the evening, one of the Leviathan unit members cracked the password on Seymour's phone. "Mr. Adams, Seymour was trading with brokers near the border. The brokers used their logistics company to cover up their dealings. They operate in a forest 10 miles away from the border." During times of unrest, medicine, weapons, and gasoline were profitable transactions. Groups of merchants had gathered together and chose a relatively safe location to camp out. If the Leviathan unit hadn't personally investigated the leads from Seymour's phone, no one would have discovered them. If one didn't enter the tiger's den, one wouldn't be able to obtain the tiger's cub. Stephen waited for Nor to recover from his internal injuries before setting off for the border at midnight. They sped down the highway under the light of the moon. There were fewer cars the closer they got to the border. Nor felt like they were rushing into things. Trading by the border is driven by lucrative benefits. It's like a wildfire that never ends. It's not realistic to put an end to their trade, not to mention there are many prisoners who've escaped among them. "That's not what I was aiming for," Stephen said. "What I want is the brokers' forward trade channel. They're skilled at what they do, and I want to make up for that trade barrier between the U.S. and the neighboring countries. Some of the neighboring countries have cut off several commercial channels to limit our country's development. The brokers are located near the border, and they have connections with them. They also have access to foreign information that we don't. If I get them under my command, it'll be like killing 2 birds with 1 stone." Nor was convinced by Stephen's flawless reasoning. As long as one of the other talismans didn't show up, he was confident that he could handle anything that came their way. They spotted a heavily guarded camp on the distant horizon. The camp consisted of soldiers from the U.S. who were on high alert from the recent turmoil in the northern lands. "Should we ask the military for assistance?" Nora asked. "No, let's search the area for the brokers ourselves," Stephen said. It was 4 in the morning. Most of the country was asleep, and it was the perfect time to carry out shady deals. After an aimless search, Stephen and Nora finally found a bustling crowd in the forest. They parked their car away from the road and blended in with them. One buyer was handing out pictures of goods he was interested in. He was looking for medicine, gasoline, and even weapons. When he met any sellers who had goods he wanted, they walked off to a secluded place to discuss in detail. Stephen scanned the crowd for the logo of the logistics company. He noticed a man at the side of the road with the logo he was looking for and went up to strike up a conversation. "Would there be any issue with smuggling a few people across the border?" "Who are they?" the man asked. "Prisoners on the run." The man was surprised by how straightforward Stephen was being. Everyone knew that those who were involved in the black market mixed in lies with the truth. Their words typically contained 30% truths and 70% lies. It was rare to meet someone so bold and honest. But where there was money to be made, who could refuse? The man couldn't turn down a deal that had been delivering itself right up to his doorstep. $700,000 per person. Deal. How much time do you need? 48 hours. We need to observe the guard's latest patrol route at the border. The fictitious business deal was easily settled. Nord generously handed the man $200,000 in cash as a deposit. The man was overjoyed. When he left to make preparations, Stephen and Nord followed him from a distance in the car. The man traveled along the border in the southwest direction and stopped in another forest 10 miles away. There were numerous tents of varying colors and crude wooden houses in the area. The owner of the logistics company was sitting beside a bonfire drinking wine. Boss, I just received a big deal. The client didn't even bargain with me. The man took out the generous deposit he'd received. The stacks of bills attracted everyone's attention. This was exactly what they were risking their lives for. Prisoners don't care about money, the owner said. Once they pass the border, they're never coming back. Dropping $1 million or $2 is nothing to them. Get the trucks ready. Find a suitable route and exit. The team moved out one after another, leaving only the owner by the bonfire. Stephen and Nor observed the situation from a tree nearby. There were 10 large trucks a short distance away. It seemed like the logistics company held significant influence at the border. Seeing that the time was right, Stephen dashed behind the owner and tapped him on the shoulder. Put down the wine glass and let's have a good chat. Isn't it lonely to drink by yourself? I'll accompany you tonight. The sudden unfamiliar voice gave the owner a scare. He immediately sobered up from the alcohol. Who are you? Your company's biggest client. The deposit was from me. The owner leaped backward, putting some distance between him and the stranger wearing a mask. Their camp was top secret. No outsider could have caught wind of their location. There were also patrols and sentries in the vicinity. How did this young man break in so easily? The owner had heard about the recent influx of prisoners in the northern lands. There were rumors that they were all martial artists from the Seven Stars prison. But it didn't matter if the young man was a prisoner or not. The border was his logistics company's territory. 15 miles away from the border was a war zone. If the young man crossed recklessly, he'd be targeted by the radar cannons and be blown up in minutes. Even martial artists like Seymour would have had to be in contact with border transport vehicles to escape safely. Are you from the Seven Stars prison? The owner asked. What do you want? Are you here because you want to set off now? No, I've changed my mind. I want to buy your company for that $200,000 deposit. The owner pulled out a dagger. Haven't you heard? Those who cause trouble at the border will die without a complete corpse. The martial artists from the Seven Stars prison are not an exception. The owner glanced at the surrounding forest from the corner of his eye. His subordinates who were on patrol should have noticed the unusual commotion by the bonfire a while ago. Why weren't they here yet? Are you waiting for your people? Stephen asked. They won't be coming. The owner scowled. You killed them? He lunged for Stephen, aiming for his vitals. The brokers at the border had survived multiple life and death experiences. They were anything but weak. The owner's dagger glinted under the moonlight. One look was all Stephen needed to know that it was smeared with poison. He dashed towards the owner, leaving after images of himself behind. The owner swung his dagger in quick succession, but he didn't come close to hitting his target. A force slammed into his back, knocking him off his feet and pressing him to the ground. Stephen held the owner down with one finger pressing firmly against his shoulder. Will you sell your company to me, or would you like to become a corpse and be thrown into the wilderness? The owner felt a strange chill spread throughout his body, gathering around his heart. He was no longer as haughty as before. You can take whatever you want. Money, trucks, information. He was trying to make himself sound useful, because he was afraid that Stephen would kill him if it turned out that he was of no use to him. But Stephen didn't have any intention of killing him. He cut his rambling short. From now on, the price of every deal you accept will be doubled. I want 50% of the profits. Every merchant is required to report the details of their goods to me without leaving anything out. Stephen stood up and tossed a piece of paper containing contact information and bank account details on the ground. Noor came over with the rest of the people from the logistics company. Their faces were swollen. The owner was relieved to find that they were alive. Long after the two strange men left, he still thought that they were prisoners who were on the run. When Stephen and Noor were a good distance away from the campsite, they took off their masks. Purchasing the broker's logistics company had gone more smoothly than they'd expected. They now had a record of anything or anyone entering and leaving the border. The sky was brightening, and dawn was about to arrive. Suddenly, an explosion erupted in the direction of the military camp they'd passed by earlier. "What's happening?" Stephen asked. "Did a fight break out at the border?" Noor checked his phone and shook his head. "There's no information. It might just be a test. That's common for garrisons at the border." Stephen agreed with them. They made their way to the car and drove to the nearest military base located in the next city. Unbeknownst to Stephen and Noor, the explosion was caused by Madellan's team, who had smuggled into the country under Brent's orders. They had been dropped off near the border by Warhawk's helicopters and were planning to take advantage of the night to approach the Leviathan Unit's headquarters. When Madellan received information that Seymour had been taken into custody, he'd adjusted the location of the explosion and taken a detour. He peered through his night vision binoculars and was satisfied with the results. The former commander's at the border. We don't know his exact location, but this big of a commotion is sure to attract his attention. Even if he's active again, he won't be able to defeat our team on his own, Madellan's team member replied. Anyone who underwent genetic modification at the Blackwater Security Company retained the intelligence of normal humans and the ability to analyze the pros and cons on the battlefield. Madellan put his binoculars away and ordered his team to slowly approach the camp to conduct a more thorough investigation. They were unaware that Stephen hadn't been lured to the camp by the explosion and had instead driven to the next city. There were often small towns and cities prosperous in both trade and transportation near the borders. Their role was to transport various resources to the military bases to lend their support. Stephen revealed his identity when he and Noor entered the city for an inspection. The general of the city guards, Jerome, jogged out of the building and led them into his office. It was typical for military bases in cities near the border to have their command centers set up in the inner vicinity to prevent being destroyed if the enemy launched a sudden attack. "Welcome to the city, Mr. Adams," Jerome said. Stephen took a seat on the couch. "Formalities aren't necessary. First, tell me what you know about the explosion before dawn. We're near the border, so we can never be too careful." Jerome had a smile on his face, but he was shaking with nerves on the inside. He wasn't expecting the sovereign himself to pay him a sudden visit. Was he here to inspect the border's defenses? He'd never met the sovereign before, so he didn't know what to make of him. His best bet was to answer his questions. "According to the surveillance, the culprit behind the explosion is a team of around 10 people. The site of the explosion was 0.3 miles away from the city gates. There was no follow-up attack. There is a high risk of ambush in these situations. Instead of sending out our troops, we stay back and monitor." He placed a blurry photo on the table in front of Stephen. Stephen inspected the people in the picture, but he couldn't make out any of their faces. He decided to settle the business with the logistics company first. He gave Jerome a rundown of the situation. "I'll ask the Leviathan unit to assist the logistic company's development and clear out the other merchants along the border to make them the only existing brokerage around these parts." Because of how far away the northern lands were from civilization, it would take a lot of time and effort to send resources and personnel to clean up the shady transactions at the border. It would be a better use of local resources to deal with them. The logistics company could prove useful in the future. "The brokers are scattered along the border," Jerome warned. "They're full of trickery. We need to be careful when dealing with them." "If they try to trick us, then that's the end of them," Stephen said. "I made sure they understand that before leaving." Noor wrote down a list of names on a piece of paper. These are the names of the Leviathan unit members stationed near the border, Stephen explained. There's no need to check their identities when they enter and leave the city. Since Stephen's identity as the Sovereign had to remain confidential in the northern lands for the time being, he didn't take Jerome up on his offer to stay at the official guest house that he'd arranged. Instead, he and Noor found an empty courtyard across the street and moved in. After a thorough investigation, Medellin didn't find any traces of Stephen. It was easier to obtain information in places with more people, so his team locked onto the city nearby. When they arrived, they split up and roamed the streets and alleys. At this time, Medellin was in a remote restaurant with two of his subordinates, sitting by the window in the attic. A wide assortment of dishes and wine were on the table. We can't waste too much time on this, Medellin said. If we can't find the former commander, then we'll stick to our original plan and attack the Leviathan unit's headquarters. Aren't their headquarters near Annapolis? His subordinate asked. It is, his other subordinate replied. Soldiers will be guarding the entrances and exits. It'll be challenging to break in. There are also strict security checks in Annapolis. It will be difficult for us to bring weapons and equipment. Mr. Brent has already contacted a multinational company stationed in the city, Medellin replied. They'll provide us with their assistance. His tone was monotone and devoid of emotion, as if the threats didn't deter him in the slightest. Members of the Blackwater Security Company who underwent genetic modification had never experienced live combat before. Brent had been anxiously waiting for an opportunity to take his revenge, and he didn't have many options when the time came. He didn't know how capable Medellin's team was, but according to the system's analysis, their individual combat strength should have reached the level of a martial artist at the Grandmaster realm. Furthermore, a smart chip had been implanted inside each of the team members, and during a fight, they had the ability to sync their movements with one another. The three of them ate a scrumptious meal, but they didn't feel anything in particular about the dishes themselves. Genetic modification had removed unnecessary factors that affected their performance in battle. In other words, their essence as a human was exchanged for strength. While Medellin was glancing out the window, he noticed a familiar passerby. Stephen was walking around the city with Noor. He'd put on a cap to hide his face before leaving the house, but even if he'd worn a mask, the chips that had been implanted in Medellin's team would have still been able to identify him through other means like physique and height. Medellin put down his glass. He's been hiding right under our noses. It was a waste of time to search the camp in the city. His two subordinates got up. Should we call the others? No. If we gather our team, he'll notice us. Have one of us tail him for now. If he leaves the city, we'll take action. As Stephen was walking down the street, he felt someone's gaze on him. Noor didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Genetically modified humans of the Backwater Security Company were similar to robots with the appearance of a human. In a natural environment, their presence was essentially the same as plants and trees. They were there, but difficult to detect. What's wrong? Noor asked. Are you not feeling well? Should we head back? Stephen looked behind them and scanned the crowd. He didn't see anyone suspicious. I have a feeling that someone's watching us, but I can't pinpoint their location. Noor took out his phone to contact Jerome and ask him to seal off the city. If there was someone who neither he nor Stephen were able to detect, their opponent must be dangerous. Stephen stopped Noor from making the call. He decided to use himself as bait to make their enemies show themselves. He took one last look at the crowd and pretended like there was nothing amiss and left the city with Noor. If confrontation was unavoidable, he might as well find a quiet place to avoid attracting attention. Seeing that the target's actions were in line with his expectations, Medellin gathered the other members of the team and hid in the vicinity. They watched Stephen and Noor head towards the forest trail outside the city. Stop hiding and show yourself, Stephen called out. His voice was low, but it echoed in all directions and carried a force that snapped branches and cracked stones. The vibration swept past Medellin and his team. They'd been caught, so they emerged from the forest and stepped into the trail. Stephen Adams, today is the day you die. Even up close, Noor couldn't sense their presence. He eyed them warily. Don't think you have the advantage just because you have more people. Medellin didn't waste any more time talking. He raised his hand, signaling for his team to make their move. They charged at Stephen and Noor without hesitation. As they fought, Stephen became more confused. I don't get it. They're not particularly strong. How are they hiding their presence from us? They wouldn't have come all the way to die for nothing, Noor said. They must have some tricks up their sleeve. None of them could get close to Stephen and Noor. They knocked them back with their kicks and punches. After dozens of rounds of the same thing, they finally realized the issue. They'd heard the sound of bones cracking, and there were visible injuries on their enemies' bodies, but they were still standing and fighting as if nothing had happened. As Stephen and Noor were contemplating, they noticed that their cuts and bruises were healing. You call yourselves martial artists? Stephen said disdainfully. You're like monsters in human skin. There was no reaction from their enemies. Aren't you being hypocritical? Medellin asked. This is a world where the strong are respected. Right after he finished his sentence, he leaped back into battle and lunged for Stephen. Stephen had been holding back because he wanted to capture them alive and interrogate them, but considering their special attributes, he couldn't be lenient with them. Okay, that was just a warm-up. Let's get serious. Stephen gathered his inner energy in his hand, forming a sharp blade. Instead of dodging, he attacked Medellin before he could get close to him. The inner energy of a martial artist at Stephen's level was sharper than physical swords. Medellin's chest and abdomen were sliced open after exchanging one blow. But his wounds didn't bleed. The skin fused back together and began to heal. Is that it? Medellin asked. I barely feel it. Stephen flipped in the air and landed 30 feet away. There's more where that came from. Before Medellin could attack again, his skin cracked and bulged from an internal explosion. When Stephen's blade came into contact with Medellin's skin, his inner energy had seeped into the blood vessels under his skin. Noor, let's go back for now, Stephen whispered. They're not easy to deal with. Okay. They took off in the opposite direction and disappeared into the darkness. A few minutes later, Medellin's damaged skin stitched itself back together. There was no emotion on his face. He and his team went back into hiding. It wasn't easy to kill a martial artist like Stephen. Every time they fought, he'd gather useful information and send it back to Brent. None of their efforts were wasted. After returning to the courtyard, Noor sent the relative information he'd obtained on their enemy from their scuffle to the Leviathan unit's headquarters. It was apparent that their bodies had been genetically modified using an advanced biochemical technology. Know yourself and know your enemy. Only then could they win 100 battles. Without the enemy's weakness, any further conflict would be meaningless. Mr. Adams, did you put all your strength into your last attack? Noor asked. Yeah, but I don't think it had much of an effect. If people like them are mass-produced, I don't know if anyone could handle them. Ordinary martial artists needed years of training to improve, but their enemies had bypassed the necessary training period and gotten to that stage through genetic modification. If the biochemical technology they used really could strengthen the body in such a short period of time, Stephen's concerns would become a reality in the future. I can't think of a way to deal with them right now, Stephen said. Let's wait for the Leviathan unit to reply. Strange technology like that can't be kept hidden for too long. Before retiring for the night, Noor contacted Jerome and sent him a picture of the enemies they'd encountered. The entire city would be under martial law. On the other side of the earth, Brent was soaking in a puddle, surrounded by beautiful women. He was satisfied with the results of tonight's battle. The lab developed an incredible technology. Normal grandmasters would have been killed the second the battle started. Medellin's team was small, but if they could create an army of soldiers just like them, Warhawk would be invincible. The U.S., the Sovereign, and the Empyrean Circle wouldn't stand a chance. Mr. Brent, do you have any other orders? Medellin asked. Do you want us to keep targeting the former commander? Drag out the conflict. Make him feel like there constantly are enemies lurking around him who he can't get rid of. It'll make him nervous and force him to keep up his guard at all times. Brent ended the call and arranged for his subordinates to post the information that Medellin's team had gathered online. He wasn't the only one who was out to get Stephen. He had too many enemies to count around the world. This information would provide them with an opportunity to analyze and dissect Stephen's martial arts. The Backwater Security Company would soon rise to fame, and Stephen's corpse would become the best advertisement to promote their business. The next morning, the Allied forces of several foreign countries appeared 20 miles away from the border. As the general of the city guards, Jerome was responsible for the city's defense. He was so stressed that he couldn't sit still. He wasn't afraid of losing his life on the battlefield, but he was worried about the sovereign's safety. The commander of the military base opened up a map on the computer. The cannons have been set up, including the high-speed anti-air cannons. The enemy will be targeted regardless of which direction they come from. The military stationed at the northern lands had been on high alert ever since they received news of the incident at the Seven Stars prison. Everyone was eager to jump into action. Jerome personally reviewed their plan. The military had taken everything into account, so he left the rest to them. "I'm counting on you. Follow the plan, but use a more conservative method than engaging with the enemy." "Yes, sir." Jerome rushed to his off-road vehicle parked outside and hurried to the courtyard where Stephen was staying. The situation at the front lines was getting dangerous, and the sovereign could not be implicated. In front of the inconspicuous house, Jerome mustered up the courage before heading inside. He ran into Noor at the doorway. "Did something happen?" "There's been a situation on the front lines. Please leave the city with Mr. Adams as soon as you can." Stephen was in the dining room and overheard their discussion. He called Jerome into the room and asked for a more detailed explanation. "Why are they choosing now of all times to approach the border?" Jerome turned on his laptop and searched for the latest news on the internet. A particular video had caused an uproar the moment it was uploaded. It was a recording of Stephen and Noor's fight yesterday in the dimly lit forest. Their faces weren't too clear, but the same couldn't be said about their movements. Their combat and martial arts techniques were on full display for the world to analyze. Unlike them, however, their enemies were blurred by mosaics. When this video was uploaded, the northern lands and the northern border became the focal point of many countries overseas. Noor cursed under his breath. "Those shameless bastards. I was too careless. I didn't see any recording devices on them." "No need to blame yourself," Stephen said. "This is obviously a well-thought-out plan they prepared to deal with us." "Our enemy has the advantage. Should we leave the northern lands?" Stephen thought about it. They wouldn't be able to avoid the enemy even if they ran to the ends of the earth. And if they returned to Washington, D.C., they would be luring the enemy back home. Before he could come up with a concrete plan, Jace returned in a helicopter. He'd seen the videos circulating online and brought a group of elite members from the Leviathan unit to ensure Stephen's safety. On the foreign mercenary websites, there was a high price for Stephen's head. When there were generous rewards, there would always be a brave man willing to take the risk. Many mercenaries were misled by the false information on the internet and underestimated Stephen's strength. From what they could see from the video, his martial arts didn't seem that impressive. With mercenaries joining the conflict, the northern border would become even more chaotic. Jace handed Stephen a document. A few months ago, Warhawk's medical industry made a significant breakthrough in their gene research. They've discovered a way to modify one's genes and catalyze the mutation to increase the strength of the human body. Stephen flipped through the document. Warhawk had tested their developments on patients with chronic illnesses who weren't suitable for surgery because of their fragile condition. When they implemented the biochemical technology, the patients underwent surgery and survived. Backwater Security Company was the name of the corporation that developed the technology. Warhawk's royal families founded this company. There's a high possibility that Brent Robinson is behind this. You mean that old man is trying to get back at us for imprisoning him for 6 months? Jace asked. Stephen nodded. That was the most reasonable explanation. If they were targeting him specifically, they would have attempted a direct assassination. They wouldn't have gone through all this trouble to set up an elaborate plan to get others to target him. They were instigating conflict behind the scenes to hide their identities and profit in hiding. They'd allied with forces outside of Warhawk, but they would still profit quite a bit from plundering cities. Luring the enemy out of hiding is simple. They've made me the target, so they'll always be keeping tabs on me nearby. With that, their next course of action was decided. For the time being, Nora and Jace would try to locate and lure out the enemy near Stephen. It was late in the morning when the owner of the logistics company woke up from his drunken stupor. The business he'd spent countless hours promoting and developing had been taken away by someone out of their league. No one would be happy about that. His team was also at a loss. "What's the plan, boss?" "Do as the fugitive says, obviously," the owner snapped. He was about to go on a rant about how despicable those two strange men were when he felt the familiar chill from last night near his heart. The owner guessed that it was some kind of remote bomb that could kill him in seconds. He sighed, sounding resigned. Those two are vicious fugitives who can kill without batting an eye. Whoever wants to go against their instructions, I won't stop you, but don't include me. The team looked at each other, but said nothing. Being detained and escaping from the Seven Stars prison was an incredible feat on its own. Going against those two prisoners on the run would be no different from a death sentence. The owner didn't stop grumbling as he reluctantly assigned his team their responsibilities for the day and told them to get to work. With Stephen's secret instructions, the soldiers stationed near the border turned a blind eye to them. As the days passed, the logistic company's business seemed to be going smoother than before. They doubled their prices, but they still had a steady stream of customers. Even though they were paying high dividends to those two obnoxious but powerful fugitives, the owner and his team were still able to amass a shocking amount of wealth in a short period of time. Their successful business attracted the attention of the prisoner ranked 10th on the list of the most dangerous criminals who'd escaped from the Seven Stars prison. Clarence Zimmer was a famous martial artist skilled with the blade. He'd set his sights on the northern lands, hoping to make easy money by snatching the goods ready to leave the border. When Clarence arrived in the region, he'd come across a truck loaded with war supplies. They were more valuable than cash. The mercenaries next to him advised him to rethink his plan. "We have different goals. You want easy cash, and we kill in exchange for a high commission. Don't forget that a war is coming. The security at the border will get tighter, and it'll be harder for you to do business." Clarence had run into the mercenaries on his way here, and they'd decided to work together. He'd thought for a moment. It wasn't a good idea to stay in a war zone for too long. He might as well follow the mercenaries and get a piece of the pie. If they failed in the assassination, he would come back later and take the logistics company's wealth for himself. The driver was about to load the truck and deliver the goods when he saw an unfamiliar face blocking the road. "Do you want to die? Get out of the way!" Clarence didn't care for small talk. He unsheathed his treasured blade and slashed in the direction of the seemingly random area in the forest. A tree in the distance was cut in half and fell over. The entire process was as smooth and quiet as water. The driver was so scared that he jumped out of the truck and begged Clarence to let him go. "You're in luck. I'm not in the mood for bloodshed today." Clarence stepped onto the truck and got in the driver's seat. The mercenaries sneaked into the back, and they set off for the city. The Leviathan unit's informants weren't stationed by the logistic company's side, but they'd set up extensive surveillance on each truck. The video from the equipment was complete with audio, and it didn't take long for Stephen to find out about Clarence and the mercenaries. He didn't care about the mercenaries, but he was interested in Clarence. There were rumors that he was a master of the blade. Stephen hadn't had a chance to test out his new weapon, and this was the perfect opportunity. He was curious as to how Clarence's blade would match up to his sword. As for those mercenaries, he would let Nora or Jace deal with them. Stephen planned to wait for them outside the city to prevent casualties. Clarence and the mercenaries were aggressive, and if he stayed in the city, there was a risk they might make their move while disregarding the pedestrians. At the border, the multi-country Allied army and the Northern Lands military were engaged in a tense standoff. The enemy wasn't planning to attack openly. Their aim was to lure the military further across the border, which would reduce the security around Stephen. They would have succeeded against ordinary targets, but against Stephen, their plan was flawed. With his level of martial arts, only people like Nora and Jace stood a chance at serving their value as his bodyguards. Jerome had become a lot less stressed after Stephen took control of the situation. He calmly looked over the reconnaissance information from the front lines as he sipped his tea. The enemy wasn't making a move, and the military had enough supplies to wait it out. The military stationed at the northern lands didn't consist of the most elite troops, but they had substantial experience on the battlefield. If they weren't skilled, the region would have long become the spoils of war for the Alliance back then. Unfortunately, the hidden transport routes at the border didn't lead to their enemy's camp. If the military launched a surprise attack, their chances of success wouldn't be too high. It was a shame, but as things stood, Jerome didn't have an opportunity to show Stephen how capable his troops were. Just as Jerome put down his cup of tea, he received news from the deputy commander that Stephen had left the city with his people and was headed to an abandoned hut in the middle of nowhere. Why did he leave? There's no place safer than the city. I believe his actions are related to the videos circulating on the internet. He doesn't want the civilians to get caught up in the battle. Maybe the enemy has already reached the outskirts of the city. Without an order from the higher-ups, Jerome couldn't arrange the city guards as he pleased. But because the sovereign was involved, he had to make an authoritative judgment. Gather 100 of our strongest soldiers at the city gate and prepare to send reinforcements to Mr. Adams at any time. Have a small group follow him while maintaining a reasonable distance. Clarence and the mercenaries weren't convinced after hearing about the unusual activity in the city. There were always significant risks involved for those in their line of work. When Stephen reached the abandoned hut, he started a bonfire to attract attention. Jace was the only one left by his side, and he was busy rushing here and there to scout the area. Stephen became restless as time passed, with no sign of the enemy. His sixth sense was telling him that the enemy would be here soon, and his intuition was confirmed when his sword resonated with someone lurking in the woods. He wondered how strong Clarence was to have triggered a reaction from his sword. After that video was leaked, people from all over the world are flocking to the northern lands, Jace whispered. We can't afford to waste too much time here. The situation at the borders isn't stable either, and the prisoners we're after are still on the loose. After being detained for so long, the prisoners had gone into hiding to recover their full strength. That was the only way they would have a shot at escaping the country. The more time they wasted at the northern lands, the stronger the prisoners would become. According to the Leviathan unit's informants, there were many prisoners on the list hiding in the Blue River Mountains. It was a large mountain range, and it wasn't easy to locate them. While Stephen was lost in his thoughts, he felt a chill in the air. He and Jace dashed to the side just as a wind current cut through the flames of the bonfire and sliced the grill in half. Clarence stood on a treetop in the distance, waving his blade. They would have been cut to pieces if they had reacted even a split second slower. Clarence wasn't in a hurry to show himself. The mercenaries beside him were like arrows released from their bows. They swarmed towards the hut. Don't blame us for this. Your life is too valuable, and there are too many who want it. Stephen didn't respond. He took a step back and let Jace handle them. Jace's sword was already in his hand. His slashes were clean and agile. They packed quite a bit of force and covered a wide distance. The mercenaries dodged, but they couldn't find an opening to get closer. The mercenaries were also quite skilled. They worked together and attacked in such a way that they covered each other's blind spots. Jace and the mercenaries fought fiercely, but neither side could get close to one another. Stephen was getting impatient. He looked into the forest up ahead, waiting for Clarence to show himself. Nora's voice sounded in his earpiece. Do you need backup? Jace can handle them. Head northwest from your location and find Clarence. Understood. The metal surface of the grill showed signs of melting. When Stephen sensed the incoming attack, a chill had settled in the air. The strange fluctuation in heat and cold proved how skilled Clarence was with the blade. Exchanging blows with him would be a satisfying match. The mercenaries only recognized the value in money and not people. They had no dignity as martial artists. They originally thought that with their advantage in numbers, completing the bounty would be a cinch. But Stephen's companion was troublesome to deal with even on his own. Jace left behind an afterimage with every slash to target multiple mercenaries and their vital points. This divided his inner energy across the board, but that didn't mean his attacks didn't carry much weight. Whenever the mercenaries clashed with his sword, a wave of pressure washed over them, threatening to overwhelm them. Jace wasn't deterred when they fended him off. Without missing a beat, he dashed towards the leader of the mercenaries and aimed for his throat. Stephen was getting bored on the sidelines. He kicked a large rock the size of his fist into the leader's side. The crack of his ribs was the only sound that came from him, because the sword in his neck silenced his scream. When Jace pulled back, he flicked his sword, deliberately spraying blood onto two incoming mercenaries' faces. Before they could wipe the blood obscuring their vision, they were dead. Nora informed Stephen that he'd found Clarence's location. "Jace, I'm heading into the forest. I'll leave them to you." "Got it. I won't let any of them escape." Clarence sensed the changes in the forest from the rustling of the leaves. He jumped down to the clearing below and swung his blade. His inner energy was infused with the wind and sliced the forest. The plants and trees within a 1,000-foot radius toppled over and littered the ground. Nor stood at the periphery of the destruction with the Leviathan unit members beside him. He'd relied on his fast reflexes to dodge the attack in the same way Stephen and Jace had in front of the hut. Clarence brandished his blade. It emitted an occasional red glow. "You're just his underlings, aren't you? I'll wipe the floor with you in no time flat. Half of the prisoners from the 7 Stars prison are on the loose, and the Leviathan unit's hands are tied. The end of this country is near." Before anyone could make a move, Stephen landed in the middle of the clearing. The aura his sword released made Clarence uneasy. He took 2 steps back to regain his composure. Just because Stephen had a fancy sword didn't mean he had the upper hand. From his appearance, he was much too young to go against a martial artist like him who had decades of experience. "You're brave for showing yourself in front of me. There are many martial artists who aren't worth the fame they get these days. Let me teach you a lesson." "All fugitives will be executed," Stephen said, lifting his sword. "Struggling is pointless." He didn't enhance his blade with his inner energy, nor did he manifest any kind of phantom. To Clarence, it seemed like he was treating this battle like a joke. It was a blatant provocation. He rushed at Stephen and aimed for his neck with a force that could split mountains. Stephen parried his blade, and they continued to use the simplest of techniques against each other. They were competing with brute force. Clarence was alarmed when his hand bled from clashing with Stephen's sword. Just how strong was he? Did he already surpass the divine Grandmaster realm? Judging from how young he was, that was impossible. It was more likely that he'd trained a technique that enhanced his physical strength. Clarence gave up on gaining the advantage of using brute force. He rushed at Stephen with the speed of a river breaking through a dam. He was fast, and the only thing Stephen saw was his figure blurring and then reappearing right in front of him. Their weapons clashed, and Clarence vanished into thin air again. His offense and defense were perfect. He deserved his reputation as a master of the blade. Stephen unleashed his aura to its limit. He left behind afterimages as he crossed the clearing. No matter how fast Clarence was and how skilled he was with the blade, he still missed his target. Stephen lightly tapped the blade of his own sword, condensing its aura into tiny prisms of light. "You can't hide for long. Your speed is dependent on your condition, and your technique is useless if your body can't keep up with your movements." Stephen had seen through Clarence's technique after exchanging a few blows. The full potential of his technique required its user to be in peak condition. He couldn't maintain his high speed for long periods of time. Clarence's laughter echoed through the forest. "I don't need that many moves to take you down. Your biggest mistake was fighting me alone without your underlings." As soon as these words left his mouth, he surrounded Stephen in a flurry of slashes from his blade, as if trapping him inside a large thorny bush. If Stephen shifted just a little, his body would be sliced to pieces. Stephen didn't need to see Clarence to know where he was. He could hear his breathing. In the next second, a rain of prisms plummeted from the sky like falling stars. Clarence's staggering figure appeared a short distance away. The prisms had pierced his skin and entered his body through an opening that was smaller than the tip of a needle. But it wasn't just one or two. The sheer number was impossible to count. Noor and his group hurried over to Stephen's side. Should we bring him back to Annapolis? No, the sword's aura is eroding his internal organs. He doesn't have long left. Clarence knew his condition better than anyone, but there was nothing he could do to reverse the prism's effects. He'd spent a lifetime cultivating his martial arts, but a young man from who knows where had bested him. Don't be too proud of yourself. People like me who like one-on-one fights are in the minority. A majority of the prisoners on the run have banded together. Whether it's the Leviathan unit or Hellcrown Palace, they don't stand a chance. Clarence's lifeless body crumpled to the ground after spitting out his last words. Noor searched his clothes, but aside from his blade, there was nothing else of value. He didn't have any talismans on him. That's why it's so hard to track down the prisoners. They're hiding and planning a conspiracy together. If they join forces, they'll be on par with the palace. Stephen hadn't forgotten about what Seymour had told them. The man in a black robe had ambushed him at the Blue River Mountains to give him the talismans. It was highly likely that the prisoners were gathering on that mountain. Jerome's troops were in charge of monitoring the official entrances and exits across the border. Any hidden back doors would have been taken into account as well, and that was the logistic company's specialty. Stephen asked the Leviathan unit members to pay the owner of the logistics company a visit. With this setup in place, he could establish an underground intelligence network at the border. Stephen returned to the city with the others without stopping for a break. He called Jerome over to the courtyard and asked him for an update about the latest situation on the front lines. Our enemy hasn't made a move. They occasionally send out a few of their people to investigate. Based on what we've experienced before, a confrontation like this usually continues for a short period of time. When their resources are used up, they'll naturally retreat. Jerome's analysis was derived from the fact that both sides had firepower at their disposal. If a fight broke out, thousands of soldiers would be killed by serial explosions. Even if the enemy destroyed the military base, they wouldn't have many people left to push further. As long as the situation didn't escalate, Stephen didn't have to worry about anything else in the northern lands except for the strange group that had undergone genetic modification. Keep an eye on the enemy and protect the border. If the conflict escalates out of your control, the Leviathan unit will assist you. With that, their business in the northern lands had temporarily come to an end. After that one encounter in the forest, Noor couldn't find any trace of that strange group. There was nothing to go on, so Stephen, Noor, and Jace headed for Annapolis. The three of them didn't leave Medellín's team's sight for even a minute. They followed Stephen's group to Annapolis, but at some point, they had to stop because they hadn't figured out a way to sneak into the heavily guarded Leviathan unit's headquarters. We could load a truck with an oil tank and have it blow up the entrance, one team member suggested. Medellín's eyes lit up. That was a good idea. It was common for trucks transporting oil tanks to enter and leave the city. Even if the guards inspected the truck, they wouldn't find anything suspicious. The plan was set. Regardless of how many Leviathan unit members survived the explosion, their team would kill off the rest. When Stephen, Noor, and Jace arrived at the Leviathan unit's headquarters in Annapolis, they heard that the leader of the unit had left a few days ago. Half of the prisoners were still detained at the Seven Stars prison, and the leader had led the group of his subordinates to repair the array. The military advisor of the Leviathan unit, Salim, led the three of them to a luxurious conference room. Mr. Adams, feel free to let me know if you need anything. The members of our organization are your subordinates. We'll carry out any orders you might have. In reality, the Leviathan unit had long lost its former glory since the riots at the prison. Salim could only maintain their image with eloquent words. Stephen didn't bother with the formalities. He'd returned to his position, and his current goal was to suppress their enemies. Tell me what you know about the situation in Warhawk. Brent Robinson has smuggled his people into the country. Whatever they're planning to do, we can't let them succeed. Salim had been investigating, but the U.S. was vast, and it was impossible to ensure that all of their defenses were airtight. Since the incident at the prison, our relevant departments have heightened security at all points of entry and exit. When foreigners enter the country, they are required to participate in a DNA test using their hair strands. If there are any abnormalities, they are detained immediately. However, no one suspicious has turned up so far. That was enough for Stephen to understand that Brent's people had sneaked into the country through the northern border. There's something else you should know, Salim continued. A group of biochemistry professors from the Backwater Security Company were on vacation on an island in Warhawk. We've sent a team to take them into custody. If Warhawk and the U.S. combined their findings in gene research, it was certain that they could create groundbreaking technology. The team had taken action some time ago, so Stephen decided to stay at the Leviathan Unit's headquarters and wait for an update from them.